Hey everybody, Timo here. Welcome to another episode of Net Present Value. We explore the intersection of money, meaning, making a difference, and the legacy that we leave behind. This episode is part of the RWA for ReFi report. RWA meaning real world assets, ReFi meaning regenerative finance. It's made possible by the Climate Collective and brought to you by Global. Originally, this was going to be a series of 10 or 20 interviews looking at DeFi projects using RWA and how that is bridging over to the regenerative finance movement. But what we've discovered is that this movement is not going anywhere. RWA and ReFi is only going to get bigger. It's going to be enormous, and the impact is just going to be gigantic. So without further ado, this is going to be a regular segment on Net Present Value. We appreciate your comments, your feedback. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and ping me on Twitter at Timo Industries if you have comments, questions, feedback, whatnot. Thanks, and see you soon. Keep up the great work. Hey everybody, Thomas Morgan here, aka Timo from Based Global. Hope you're doing well. I have a special edition of the RWA for ReFi report. There's also a hybrid interview, one that's been on my docket for a long time. We're going to be around, we're going to cover real world assets, real estate, climate change, climate justice, a lot of natural capital, I think. Today, my guest is Martijn Wilder of Pollination. Pollination is a global climate change in investments and advisory firm. Martijn is founder and CEO of Pollination. He is a recognized global leader in climate law and investment, and has advised governments and companies on innovative climate finance investments, including the world's first Red Plus green bond. Martijn was head of Baker McKenzie's global climate law and finance practice for 20 years and held key roles with Australia's clean energy finance institutions, Australian Renewable Energy Agency, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and Low Carbon Australia. He is currently chair of the governing board of the Vienna-based Renewable Energy and Efficiency Partnership, president of World Wildlife Fund Australia, chair of the Victorian government's independent expert panel on Victoria's 2035 climate change target. He is an adjunct professor in international climate change law and a senior advisor to Serendipity Capital. Martijn has numerous other philanthropic and academic accomplishments and pursuits that are too long to mention here. But Martijn, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. Nice to be here.
Great. So Martijn, I've had the pleasure over the last year of getting to know you a little bit better. I feel like there's a lot of overlap of everything I'm interested in and doing and everything that Pollination is doing. I feel like in a lot of respects, we speak the same language when it comes to real estate and natural capital. And you were gracious enough last year to help us with our climate sprint that we did around ecosystem services and co-benefits in carbon removal, which resulted in the core benefits label. So I just wanted to send a shout out to that and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do that.
No worries. Pleasure.
Great. So I'd like to start with Pollination as a group, right? I'd like to zero in on the name. I love the name. If you could just give a little background of how you came up with it.
Yeah, good question, because often people don't really ask that. So when we set the firm up 3 years ago, we were looking to do some initial fundraising just to seed capital, get the firm going. And I happened to be in the US, and I'd organized to go up to see Jeremy Grantham in Boston, in fact, and just have a chat to him about what we were doing. I'd met Jeremy 7 years before that, and on and off, I'd reached out to him once or twice, knew some of his team, went up to see him in Boston. We caught up, went to his office down below with him and one of his colleagues down at the Starbucks below. And the first 20 minutes, Jeremy was talking about, because it was actually quite a hot topic, the challenge with the bee population in California and the fact that it had collapsed and they were having to ship bees in. And we got in this discussion before I even got into talking about what we were planning to do with this new firm. And I was really getting Jeremy's advice, but I guess at the same time, see if they were interested in potentially seed funding it. And he said, well, once you've got your idea, come back to us. Then came back to Australia and was talking to another friend of mine in Australia who lives in the country and has one of the best, most remarkable gardens in Australia with many endemic species. He's even got redwoods in the middle of this country town in Australia, this beautiful garden. A guy called Mark Burrows, who's also a UNEP senior advisor. And Mark said to me, what are you going to call this thing if you set it up? And I said, well, yeah, I've been thinking about it. Maybe something to do with nature. He said, yeah, it's got to be nature focused. And I said, well, what about pollination? He said, that sounds a good name. And that we went from there. So that's really how we got the name. And I think in one sense, it's pretty apt because not only is the firm a lot about pollinating ideas, but we have a really large focus on nature. And in that sense, a lot of the core of what we do is to be investment platforms in the nature space. And Pollination is a very appropriate name.
Yeah, and I love it how you generally refer to everything you do as nature or nature investment, which a lot of times I think people think it's a juxtaposition or kind of an oxymoron of like financializing nature. But to me, I don't think we have any other choice at this point to invest in nature, protect nature, conserve nature, restore nature. So I love how you just nature is core to everything you do.
And I mean, difficult, right? So we've had for many years, people, and in the last year, many of the big investment banks around the world have made a call for the need for trillions of dollars into nature. The challenge is that as an investment class, traditionally nature doesn't provide a return on investment. So for investors looking to make 10, 12, 15, 20%, they're not going to get that from investing in protecting an area of rainforest, where the alternative use often may be big agricultural company coming in, chopping it down and growing palm oil, and that make a significant rate of return. So we have to change the balance that nature is capable of being valued, value is capable of being measured, and that we can get an economic return. In some areas, we do see that, and there are some legal regimes around the world give you credit or give you value protecting nature. There are also others who are more innovative in valuing nature and understand if you destroy nature, it will have an impact on your balance sheet and your supply chain. And with the TNFD, we're seeing more and more of that realization today. I think part of the journey that we are going on and really tried with climate asset management joint venture is to say, look, in 5-10 years' time, we want to be able to take pension funding, other money and invest it in wildlife, invest it in biodiversity, and get an economic return for investors. We may not be there today, but we can start today by doing investments in those activities that impact nature, like regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, do that in a way that provides an economic return, so helps to build the biodiversity bank, etc. And then over time, move into those other areas as the regimes develop, put a real value on the more traditional.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the ways you're doing that is utilizing or exploring the use of the carbon markets. And last time we talked, or I guess one of the first times we talked, you had mentioned separating those two things out, nature, natural capital, and carbon. You just kind of into both those two things?
Yeah. So today, carbon has been a way to earn revenue for doing activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you're switching from a fossil fuel to renewable energy, you can claim a reduction in emissions, and under certain standards, you can sell those. The big shift, I guess, in the last sort of few years has been a real focus on those projects in the nature space that actually reduce carbon. So things like preventing rainforests being destroyed, replanting degraded areas, planting mangroves, growing seaweed, all those sorts of things that those nature-based activities reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in doing so, you measure it and create carbon credits. You then sell those carbon credits, whether it's on a compliance market under the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM, or under voluntary markets like the California climate market, and then trading those certificates and using that revenue to fund the underlying projects. In that sense, carbon has been a default revenue stream to help fund investment in nature, but protecting biodiversity, protecting bird species, protecting watersheds doesn't actually produce credits under any sort of formal regime for which you can get revenue. There are one or two projects and programs around the world for ecosystem services, but as a whole, not at the level that the carbon markets are. And so while there's often a lot of criticism of carbon markets, the truth is where there's a very legitimate projects that have a significant ability to protect nature and reduce carbon, the ability to sell that carbon is fundamental to financing those underlying nature projects.
Yeah, we can get into additionality and permanence later, but there's criticism of those two technicalities around nature-based projects. For one, I feel no guilt or shame using carbon markets to finance nature-based solutions. I think you would agree.
Yeah. And the truth is, any activity you do, whether it's carbon, whether it's doing a residential property development, it has to have integrity. People are going to want to know the project and activity that you're doing and the product that they are buying is robust, and it's going to be permanently there. And that's entirely legitimate. That's exactly how it should be. I think when people criticize for not being additional or not being permanent, nobody would argue with that. People would say, yes, that's exactly right, which is why we need to focus on those. So I think rather than there being a lot of endless criticism of activities being not additional or not permanent, people need to just accept that those activities that don't have those characteristics are not permitted, and that the rules-based system we develop has proper mechanism to ensure permanence. And schemes like Vera and schemes like the Australian Offset Program, there are very stringent rules and penalties as to what happens and mechanisms to restore a loss of permanence. So if you have trust in the underlying legal system that creates these offsets, then you should be able to be confident that they will have integrity, they will be additional, and they will be.
And just to dig into that a little bit more with additionality, a 1.5 degree plus world, is it not true that everything is additional when trees are dying and ecosystems are failing? And basically, if carbon markets can fund ecosystem restoration, like why isn't that additional?
Carbon markets can't fund at scale. There isn't enough. The carbon market's not big enough to fund the trillions of dollars we need to restore nature. So one, it's not sufficient. Number two, there's a lot of opposition to carbon markets, which means it's piecemeal around different parts of the world. And the fact that we need to hit a Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees, the truth of the matter is we're not heading in that direction. We're already overshooting that. And unless there's dramatic intervention, we will not get there. So I would say we are continuing to have a global rapid rate of deforestation. We're continuing to have a rapid rate of biodiversity loss. Simply putting in a statement that we're going to meet a target does not remove additionality. And in many least developing countries, they want a right to develop. They want the right to be able to access lands, to access their timbers, to chop the forest down to some degree in a sustainable way. That is happening. So it certainly is not a case of any activity is no longer additional. We should actually be encouraging everything and providing incentives to do that.
Yeah, it goes back to they want the global south or the least developed countries want the same rights that we've had for the last 100, 200, 300 years, and more power to them.
Yes, correct. So if, for example, we say that, okay, we don't want it to be additional, then there should be trillions of dollars being funneled into those developing economies to fund those economies to grow, to help them not need to chop down their rainforest, to help them with the transition to net zero, and also more broadly to help them with social issues, community issues, to help them with the eradication of things like COVID. It should be a real problem. And at the moment, quite frankly, it's not.
So I want to go back up a minute to number one there. You said that I think the carbon markets are not big enough to fund the nature crisis. I'm in the regenerative finance space, and there's all this hype around carbon and how big the carbon markets are going to be. And I'm like yelling, screaming, whispering, saying, hey, come over here. The nature markets are way bigger and way more important. Carbon is a co-benefit of nature is the way I look at it. And so when you look at carbon investment market size, what numbers do you use? Do you use the Paulson report or the financing for nature, or what's Pollination use?
In terms of how big
The nature, what we need, it's not even how big the nature market is, but like the financing for nature, off the top of my head, we need 700 billion a year for the next 8 years to avoid a mass extinction crisis.
Yeah. So look, there are many numbers floating around, whether it's the Dasgupta review or whether it's what Paulson or others have done, or whether it's coming out of the Biodiversity Convention. You're hearing numbers that we need trillions of dollars to invest in nature to reverse the decline. Whatever the number is, we're well of that. And one of the challenges, again, is people don't value nature properly. And, while there are lots of very small and important initiatives, whether that's Bezos going to a particular country like he's been doing lately, giving them $30 million, at the end of the day, that doesn't really move the dial. I never forget sitting in a meeting in Indonesia 5-6 years ago, discussion about Norway funding $1 billion to Indonesia if they were to reduce deforestation over a period of time. And one of the major forestry companies in Indonesia said, well, we make $5 billion a quarter chopping down rainforest. So the economics are just wrong, right? And skewed. And when you look at those sorts of numbers, it's just a drop in the oceans. We need some really sophisticated legal mechanisms and other measures that drive investment into nature, make it a compulsory requirement, put a real value on it. Because at the moment, we're just not valuing it. Coming back to my example at the beginning about bee populations, if the bee population collapses, then pollination food chains collapses, a lot of the ecosystem collapses. Aren't saying in advance, why is that important? What value does that have? how can we make sure it's sustainable? I mean, they are now, but historically they haven't. So it's sort of like an afterthought as opposed to a today, how do we value the inputs of this? So if people are saying, well, I go and dig iron ore up, or I dig up critical minerals to build it may be, or I'm building batteries, that has a value. Ultimately, if I'm growing fruit, I sort of for granted bee populations and the clean air is a public good that I have a right to. In fact, nature's not just a public good, it's a key part of the supply chain. And just because someone doesn't own it doesn't mean it isn't valuable. So I think trying to deal with these concepts in a different way is really, really
Yeah, I
important.
think to me, that's some of the hardest part of all this work is getting people to price or pay for what we know is valuable, right? We know it's almost an infinite value that it provides, the ecosystems provide for humans and animals and species. And how do we appropriately value that? Do you think like the task force for nature related financial disclosures or the task force for climate related financial disclosures are going to putting line items and natural capital accounts on this is going to help?
Absolutely. So I think the TCFD really drove a lot of the attention to the importance of assessing climate risk and then informing investors how companies were exposed and what that meant, and then starting to value that. Now that took quite a long time. Towards the end, gained a huge momentum, has had incredible global impact. FD is just copying the playbook of that, and so we'll go a lot quicker. So one of the things that we're already seeing is that there are companies now who are preparing annual reports around their nature value. They're assessing the nature risk to their business, which is something they had not done before, following on from climate risk. That is creating a greater awareness of the connectivity between a business and nature and the reliance that it has on nature. And that's really very important. So I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing is we will see the TNFD play a really important role. And it'll take time, but we're already seeing people drafting these sort of natural capital reports, which sit alongside sustainability reports, which is pretty much unheard of a year or two ago.
Me, you're talking about the connectivity, like, and you mentioned risk and resilience. That's an integral piece of the puzzle of how we tell this story. And like, hey, if we reduce risk or if we take these preventative rather than corrective actions, we're going to save a lot of money in our global economy. How is Pollination thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that is very true. And I'll give you a good example of, and again, it's having to change people's thinking. So we were talking to a port up near the Great Barrier Reef, and every year the problem with that port had was quite a lot of runoff, and it was having to spend $10 million dredging every year. And the point was made to them, if you actually plant upstream on the river a whole lot of trees, and you start utilizing the entire river system, the amount of silt that comes into the port area will be minimized. The need for dredging will, over a couple of years, pretty much disappear to a very small amount. And your $10 million a year will maybe go down to $500,000 a year or $1 million a year. But you make that initial investment in nature for that. And so quite often companies just don't think that way, and they don't think of those sort of solutions. It's about immediate costs and not long-term planning. And so I think getting a view around that's very important. I know that's been done quite successfully in areas in the US, like in Washington, DC. It's
With the nitrogen and phosphate market.
those exactly. And so those markets have played a key role in cleaning waterway. And so I think the role of sort of natural capital markets, ecosystem markets is actually very important. We just need to continue to build those.
To me, when you mention upstream or downstream, our project is called Basin, and we're watershed focused, and looking at that upstream, downstream effects for a reason. I feel like this fits nicely. I think that kind of thinking, like into the circular economy of like that, all these like the carbon markets are not in a silo. Natural capital is not in a silo. Fossil fuels are not in a silo. Science is not in a silo. It's all connected into the circular economy. But what kind of work is Pollination doing around the circular work?
Yeah. So, I mean, what you're describing is really taking a landscape approach, right? So we are actors in a much broader landscape in which what we do interacts with everything in that landscape, from biodiversity through to nature, through to carbon, through to everything that you do. And so understanding the broader ecosystem, but then that ecosystem itself connects to other ecosystems. So I think a lot of the work we are doing, we're not so much doing a lot in the broader circular economy in terms of plastics and the like, but what we're looking at is really, particularly in nature, how you assess entire landscapes and ecosystems. So one of the projects we've been working on is working with one of the authority groups in Queensland, Australia. Land is a very large area, and part of that landscape includes the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef, and trying to do a natural capital account of what is the natural capital value of that entire landscape and how does it all interact together. So that region has everything from sugarcane through to other beef agriculture, through to lots of tourism, mangroves, the Great Barrier Reef, residential development, tree, but also a lot of natural nature reserves as well. So if you take that ecosystem and you look closely at how it all interacts, and in doing so, what the value of that is in the different parts and how it collectively comes together. Yeah, that's a good example of what we're doing on a more
Have you checked out the One Earth Bioregions 2020 work at all? I think you'll
think
find
so.
that totally interesting. It's in the ReFi space. There's a lot of talk around bioregionalism and local currencies and natural capital backed currencies, and the idea of organizing by watershed or by basin or by bioregion. The One Earth group is just amazing. I think it was like 2 years worth of work around taking ecoregions and bioregions
Yeah.
and kind of putting them together. Tell me about your nature.
Yeah, so I was going to say, my team has been doing a lot of work in Kenya with the government there, looking at watersheds, and that's been very much done on a basin approach. And we've written quite a large piece on global issues of water, which was published probably about 9 months ago. But one of the big issues that we raised there was you need to look at the water issues within an entire water ecosystem basin approach, not in just sort of individual river systems. So the work we're doing around that was very much.
I think when you bring up water, to me, water is a huge part of the carbon cycle. And this idea of like this tunnel vision around carbon, it's really irritating me if you can't tell. Like looking at all this stuff from a holistic lens, biodiversity, water quality, water quantity, habitats, carbon is just a subset in that greater group. What is your nature incubator doing? How's that coming along?
Yeah, so I think the idea there was that one of the few things that we're doing. So I just want to come back for a moment, your frustration with carbon. I think one of the challenges is that an ideological view among certain countries and certain players that you shouldn't have any carbon offsets because all emission reductions should be done at source in country. I think we have to be a bit more pragmatic here because we have a made barrier to reach 1.5 degrees. Some of the technologies just don't exist to eliminate, for example, all emissions from steelmaking. We can get a long way there, but we're not quite there. So, and also on scope 3, it's often quite hard. So if you're a company that has a lot of scope 3 emissions in an overseas developed country, if you can actually fund a lot of landscape redevelopment in those countries, get some credit for that and share the credit benefit with those other countries, then that's arguably a good thing. Unless we have a situation where Western governments and Western corporations are funding all of the reductions around the world in all of the industries that we never need credit, that would be an alternative, but that just isn't happening. On the nature incubator issue, one of the things I think is a real challenge, this was particularly in nature-based carbon projects, is that getting any sort of project or activity up often requires a lot of skill, a lot of technical capability, requires early stage capital. It's quite challenging because many of the developers we see of nature-based carbon projects, which also have a nature element in them, is that they're relatively unsophisticated and they need a lot of help. So part of our thinking was if we can create partly an incubator and partly a early stage fund seeding vehicle that can help fund that would be a good thing. And so in many of the projects that we've reviewed where people want to make an investment to get offsets, they're just too early stage, or they just are missing some of the critical bits, although they don't have any corporate governance wrapped around them. So you need to actually build that. So that was really the idea, to bring more things to market, make sure that they're financially stable as an investment. And so we think in the nature space, again, is also a lot to be done. So one of the biggest challenges we face in nature is how do you measure? So if you want to create any sort of nature investment or nature value or a nature credit, what is the underlying metric that you use in order to measure biodiversity or to measure watershed protection or to measure a particular species? That's one issue. How do you then compare from one area to another? We're also favorable to what is biodiversity or nature offsetting, that you can destroy one piece of pristine nature and expect to replace it with something else. We think that actually the system needs to really be about people having an obligation to keep a certain amount of nature in place and then off the back of that baseline, build more nature. So the obligation is actually to invest in nature and create nature offsets additive to the underlying baseline. So that's very important. And then the final issue, which we think is also very important and which is hotly contested, is whether you're measuring nature value on the input side or the output sides. do you say, well, I'm going to protect nature and get a credit for it? Or do you actually say, well, yes, you get an initial credit. It needs to be actually occur over a number of years. So it comes back to the permanence issue, right? Which comes back to the output. Are you actually creating the output of protecting nature, or are you just making a commitment at the beginning to do so? And we think that you can't have one without the other. And again, it's similar to carbon, which is that you do an activity to protect nature. You have a baseline, and every year you make sure there's a continuing nature protection, and you're enhancing and growing the biodiversity and the value of
Yeah, that was actually on my list to ask you is about the offset economy and the idea of one for one. And a lot of people would like our world to be fossil fuel free, but right, that's just not, we'll starve, right? Societies will collapse. And so the offset economy to a certain extent makes sense. And so with nature, like you can't stop eating food and vegetables and cutting down trees and fiber and whatnot. So I love that approach of the baseline, and then you can take off the back of the baseline to then, and then that funding. Like the way I heard you say that, it's like a circular, like regenerative mechanism in there to fund more nature on the back.
Yeah, so what we're basically saying is that we have a state of the environment of nature. We have a state of the nature as it is at the planet. We can't degrade it more. We have to build on that. Unfortunately, you cannot at the moment stop certain countries just deciding they will continue to destroy nature or allow development to, with environmental impact assessments being done to minimize the impact. But the truth of the matter is we need to ensure that all development is sustainable and all development has as limited impact as possible. Some will have an impact, but as best we can, we can't just say to somebody, it's okay to destroy the area of rainforest if you go tree somewhere else, because the one for one doesn't work. So what we should really be saying is that all companies have an obligation to make sure that they understand the impact they have on nature, to measure that impact nature, and to then also start to build a credits for nature, start to have an obligation to invest in nature and restoration projects that are over and above what they do. Industry will complain that's a cost, operating an environment which has a lot of public goods in it, and nature itself is a public good, and we need to protect that. So you need to start restoring that public good because it is being diminished at this point in time. Remember, we were doing quite a large piece of work to draft a sustainable development law in Gabon. This was back in 2014. And as part of that discussion in the group, we're having this argument of if there is an area of rainforest where you want to produce a mine that has billions of dollars of revenue for government, but there is one frog left, that's the last frog in the world that's endangered. How do you put a value on that one frog versus billions of dollars to the economy to lift people out of poverty? It's a really difficult discussion. There'll be many different views on it, and there's not actually an easy answer to, because it is values laden. It is a philosophical argument, and it depends on the ranking you put on things.
Yeah, it's hard philosophical questions around what you can take, what you can kill, what you can keep, what you can charge for, what's a public good, what's not a public good. Something that comes up here, we'll have to talk further about it, but I would like to extend a hand from the ReFi community or the regenerative finance community that's getting a bad name with like crypto and blockchain. But if we put that under the hood and we look at like the philosophical things we're trying to do around public goods, around regenerative funding, regenerative finance, for example, the startup incubation, like you should totally get involved with the ReFi DAO. We have hundreds of startups that you could incubate, review, look at. We can learn from your position, your background in law, in finance, in traditional corporate world, or we call it TradFi, traditional finance. And that I think there's like this, like I posted on LinkedIn last week, like ReFi or crypto, we're not just like cartoon avatars behind a Twitter profile. There's actually real people with real law degrees, PhDs, doctorates, masters. They come from all walks of life and all bits of experience, and they care just as much as the people who are scared of blockchain and scared of Web3 and scared of crypto. So I would like to reach out that hand. And we've talked about this before, but I just want to officially do it.
Yeah, look, I have no issue at all. It's true that, and I come back to the view that in any economy, whether it's crypto, whether it's normal, there are always going to be cases of fraud and challenges. In the early carbon market, in the European emissions trading scheme, there was an early tax fraud and somebody went to a registry and illegally traded carbon. There are bad people who do bad things sometimes, and that doesn't make a whole sector bad. It's just partly how it is, right? However, as a system, I think one of my observations is that, look, blockchains, I've done quite a bit of work in that, and that's great. I think one of the challenges has been with some of the tokens that have been claimed to be nature tokens and aren't backed by any underlying nature. People are just selling a token like a doggy coin being sold, making a lot of money, and because they like to trade something that has a label. That's just a different marketplace, right? I think when we come back to your original comment about integrity, if someone wants to create some sort of cryptocurrency that's or some sort of token that's backed, that's associated with nature, then if the claim is a token, ton of nature, question is then how do you measure that ton of nature? What is a ton of nature? Where is it? How do you see it? And how do you ensure it's occurring? So there's no problem with the medium, just making sure that whatever medium is does have a link. And I mean, you and I talked about one of those ideas, like, and I have seen this a lot along the way, like Candy Crush, right? So if you created a game whereby people were this game and the money was going into protecting rainforest and was actually being used then to fund on the ground protection, if that's another way to raise revenue, it might be small, but it's still important. Right? We can do that's innovative, in my view, to try to protect nature is a really worth having a crack at. Even in the you and I had a chat about what's the
Metaverse.
Yeah,
Metaverse.
the metaverse. So like setting up in the megaverse, rainforest that mirror what's on the ground and getting people to fund the protection of those and using that funding to partly protect what's on the ground. If that can be done. It raises awareness among a generation that's not necessarily as exposed. It helps to get different ways to do things. If people are active in the metaverse and people like Microsoft are building it, then why don't we bring the two together to create awareness and create better?
There's a lot of talk right now in both worlds, TradFi and ReFi, around MRV in that, the ground truth. And I was reading through the TFND reports or TNFD report the other day and mentioned blockchain. They mentioned legitimacy. They mentioned trust. They didn't necessarily call it scope 1, 2, and 3, Martin, but like, to me, I see like what they're trying to do is basically look at the corporate supply chain, right? Of like, where does stuff come from? Where does it go? And what's the impact? What's the truth behind that?
Yes, I think there is a lot of, I think a lot of people just don't really understand blockchain and what it serves and what different technologies are. I think there is a lot of work being done by organizations like IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, to really endorse blockchain and tokenization of carbon and basically create a good rule system to allow that to happen. I think a lot of people just don't understand it. And so that's an education process that has to go through to get people used to that, I think. I mean, in nature, how you describe scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 nature is a pretty complicated issue. So, but if you follow the carbon process, you're responsible for your impact on scope 1, indirectly scope 2, then what you do with your products can affect nature elsewhere. So if you're producing a product like plastic and that plastic then ends up in another country and all over that country's floor and in the oceans, then that is your scope 3, but it's directly as a result of the product that you make. So the responsibility then not to create biodegradable plastic or to, as a lot of the supermarket chains have done around the world, no longer have plastic bags. They are taking responsibility that the activities they create end up down the supply chain causing real problems. So I think that is all part of the journey that we're going to have to go on around.
Yeah. So we're so much I could talk about here and more stuff that's already come up. But I wanted to come back to something you said earlier about land degradation, land restoration, one of the core drivers of climate change and one of the core problems of climate change. As you and I have discussed, I've spent 20 years in the commercial and investment real estate business. And so everything I'm doing, I have these real estate goggles on, right? Oh, land is real estate and carbon is real estate and ecosystems is real estate. I know Pollination is doing some stuff around real estate. What's your kind of your take on land use and real estate? I know you're doing stuff at the policy level and you're doing some project development stuff, but generally, if you could discuss land use and real estate.
Yeah. So I think, number one, and you've touched on this earlier today, it's when you're doing residential developments or industrial developments, whatever it may be, how do you do those in a way that is more sympathetic with the landscape and building in the landscape? How do you make buildings that are more energy efficient? How do you make buildings out of materials that are recyclable? So in Australia, a lot of shifting from concrete to timber build. And if you think about timber build and you think about it in a whole ecosystem approach to growing forests that are sustainable, continuing to grow those forests, putting wood into the buildings that you build, recognizing that there's a carbon content in that. The California offset program incorporates into it harvested wood products. So when you chop a tree, it recognizes that there is a embodied carbon continues there. And that's also about how do you incorporate nature and create buildings that are no gas, no water, self-generating electricity, They have, for example, green roofs so that the cooling is there, the insulation is better. So it's just about being highly innovative in how we do things. And then if you're building large residential developments, you often see in parts of the world where people just clear huge areas of land, build massive developments, no trees, just a pretty denuded landscape. So how do you build developments that you make sure that integrated into those is a huge amount of biodiversity and nature around them? One of the challenges is you will have arguments from a lot of property developers that it's just too expensive. You can't do this. It adds so much money to create a much more efficient building with double glazing, etc. Housing is expensive as it is, and we're trying to provide low quality housing. That's a challenge. But over time, as we do more of this, the costs will come down. It's interesting in public housing in a lot of countries. I know this is the case in Australia. Government actually subsidizes electricity bills and gas bills and water bills. If you actually, one of the things here has been how do you retrofit those houses and pay for them so that they're self-sufficient on solar, self-sufficient on water, have gas. Within a couple of years, you're not actually paying an energy bill or a water bill. As a result, the government itself saves a lot of money. So that upfront investment ultimately makes social housing cheaper. So what we're really trying to do is to really over time, change the whole way in which the built environment is done, and we're in the building sector.
I think a lot of the driver comes back to cost. You touched on it earlier about the cost of a future carbon development or nature-based solution project, or even what you're talking about with residential development of like the developer doesn't want to take on the cost of the tree of planting trees or around trees, which would provide shade and in turn lower the utility bill, saying, hey, look, the utility and the cost of urban heat is not our responsibility. So we're going to make it easier for us to develop. But if we could figure out mechanisms, right? Shade, right, is a huge part of this whole carbon cycle. I think it's an underestimated attribute, cooling effect.
And when you look at cities that are have a very high heat loads, by bringing in a lot of native vegetation and other things within those cities, you basically do bring the temperature down. But just a broader example on infrastructure is that in California, Australia, we've had huge bushfires, terrible, wiped out huge amounts of areas. And so those houses do have to be built that are fireproof. But secondly, you shouldn't be building houses that are in the middle of a bushfire zone. And then thirdly, there's a whole debate here about the electricity lines that ran through the national park all got burned down. So rather than rebuilding them, build them underground and insulate them. And then the argument was, oh, that's too expensive. We can't do that. It takes too long. And so they rebuilt the lines, and the next bushfire season, they were burnt down again. So now the cost of rebuilding those has actually far outweighed what would have been to do them underground in the first place. So we have to build housing and infrastructure that is climate resilient. That's what we need to do. And so unless we're doing that, it's we're not going to be able to move the dial on this stuff. So we have to actually
they're going to pay now or we're going to pay later. Just depends on what we choose.
Yeah. And if we pay now, we may be able to adapt so that the consequences later are not so significant.
Yeah, 100%, Martin. So Pollination recently has been doing a series called Navigating a Nature Positive Future. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And also Pollination, I admire the people I've interfaced with, the Pollination with around indigenous rights in climate and environmental justice as well. And that series you're doing around Nature Positive Future covers some of that stuff.
Yes. So we have a fantastic team of people whom, particularly in the UK, the US and Australia, who are very passionate, very knowledgeable and leading on nature. And got to give credit to those guys for everything that they're doing, because they're working very hard on understanding nature risk and the like. And I think someone decided to sort of do, because nature is a very important issue and people are learning about it, we tried to develop a series on how we talk to people about nature and what things like nature positive means and what nature risk means, and the critical importance of Indigenous communities to nature, the history that Indigenous groups have of their knowledge on environments and nature, and the important role that they play as custodians of nature, whether that's with First Nations people in Canada, wherever that may be. So I think that's really, for us, that's a really critical part of what it is that we are wanting to bring to the market. And a lot of these issues, to be fair, are new, right? So talking about how you nature risk for a business, and talking about how you also measure nature, and talking about what it means for a company to be nature positive as opposed to climate positive. And running that narrative is a lot of the work that we're trying to get out into the market and start the dialogue on. I think part of this is responding to the fact, as I said earlier, a lot of financial institutions at the start of the year called for the need to invest trillions and trillions of dollars in nature without any real gaps on how to do that. So if we don't start socializing these issues and getting people across them and starting to move the entire agenda, it's going to be very difficult to achieve.
Yes, so much of it is education and storytelling around it, it seems like.
Correct.
I love, Martin, your approach around, hey, look, you simplify it down really well. Like, the problem's huge. It's trillions of dollars. We need to do everything we can. Get caught up in some of these arguments, like the philosophical arguments around additionality and permanence, but I love the way that you distilled it down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here, you mentioned at the beginning, I'm chairing the Victorian government's panel on its 2035 target. Now, Victoria is an Australian state it's not particularly large, but it is one of the only countries in the world to have climate legislation, which is sort of similar to the UK legislation, where every 5 years they set a climate budget and target. Every department in the government has to decide how to reduce emissions, and they have a legislative commitment to net zero by 2050. So in order to get there, they have to plan for it. So what the law does is it allows them to plan. But the really interesting thing about that is that we are looking here at saying, okay, we want to get to net zero by 2050. That is an enormous task. And they have two very large coal-powered electricity generators, which are not owned by government, but by the private sector. The private sector will decide when to shut those down. If they decide to move earlier, then there's a huge problem of filling a huge amount of energy generation capacity. Had very terrible bushfires in the past. They have very good resources on offshore wind. And so setting a target requires a major fundamental economic transition for that economy. And that's going to require a lot of planning, a lot of policy, and a lot of investment. But it's a phenomenal opportunity also to create a whole lot of jobs, create new industries, and it's very exciting. So it's a lot to balance and it's a lot to do. But if we're not ambitious and we're not about this and we're not focused on how to drive real change, and by the way, in that scenario, natural capital will play a huge role. They have a lot of forests and a lot of land there. It's just really important to look at it in that context. And if we get stuck, I'm not in any way diminishing integrity or issues of additionality, etc. But if we get stuck in too much minutia, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. The task before us on nature is enormous. We're in a nature crisis, and we have to do everything we can to turn that around.
Yeah, I like it. Two sides of the coin, right? There's the crisis and there's the opportunity. And I think it's the World Economic Forum, maybe, that call it the new nature economy, like a $10 trillion economy by 2030. Yeah. So the idea of getting people on board to steward land and take care of your communities and restore and regenerate, conserve, pretty exciting, right? If we can get out of the doldrum, as a few of us have said in ReFi, get away from the climate FUD, the fear, uncertainty, of doubt, and move to climate FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. How can we get people excited about the new nature economy and the opportunities? That's exciting to me personally.
I totally agree.
Hey, Martin, I really appreciate your time. Enjoy our dialogue and keep up the great work.
No worries.
Great. Pollination website, the best place for people to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, look, it is. And I've got an opportunity. The people out there who are really interested in nature and what we do, we're always recruiting, we're building, particularly in the US, always welcome anybody to get in contact. I guess the last point I'll leave you with, because, talk about this, ultimately, there is a community of people who really care about this, and yourself and ourselves and everybody are all in that community. And this is not a competition. This is about working together for the best outcome for the planet. And so the more that we can do together through ReFi and everything else, the better it is. So collaboration and cooperation are key. And there's a commitment for us to do the best that we can. I think it's just really important. So yeah, welcome people to look at the website, we'll get in touch, but just working together as well.
It just occurred to me, we didn't even discuss HSBC and climate asset management, but we can save that for another one, or people can look online, those two organizations. So
no worries.
Great. Well, thank you, Martin.
No worries. Pleasure.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening, watching. Please make sure to check out the guest website and social. Also check out climatecollective.org and basin.global to get your own basin. Personally, I think the climate and nature crisis is going to be solved by guests like that and people like you, place by place by place, on purpose. So keep up the great work, everybody. And as we say in ReFi, LFG.